So thank you for joining us for our panel. We're going to talk about local power. And I think the unofficial title for this panel is When They Go Low, We Go Local. So just keep that in mind. My name is Meghan Sahli-Wells. I am the California Director of EOPA, Elected Officials to Protect America. I'm also the former mayor of Culver City. And EOPA is a network of elected officials who are committed to protecting the planet, the people on the planet, and ensuring environmental justice and democracy for all. We also want to give a shout out to some of our EOPA members who have been joining us for this conference. I know we have Tribal Council member Philip Williams. We have Humboldt County Supervisor Mike Wilson, and also Benicia Council member Carrie Birdseye. If you are an elected official and I didn't call your name, please see me and we'll get you in our network. So the goal of this panel is to create a space for dialogue on local decision-making on offshore wind, how we implement it on the ground, what it's going to look like in our communities, and we're going to have that discussion with folks who are the decision makers and also our thought partners to make sure that we have best practices and are doing right by our communities. From a logistics perspective, again, we'll be talking up here for a bit, but then we're going to really want to hear your questions. And to frame the discussion, we're going to start. There we go. Oops, there we go. We're going to start with the support. So EOPA has a sign-on letter of elected officials throughout the state of California who have shared their strong support for offshore wind to replace polluting fossil fuels that are impacting their communities with renewable energy that will power the community and also empower their community with good jobs, thriving economies, and great careers. And I wouldn't be a good organizer if I didn't use this opportunity for a call to action. So there is a QR code that you can see here. Please take a look and see if your elected official, your mayor, your county supervisor, your state legislator is on our letter. If they are not, please tell them to sign onto our letter to support offshore wind in our communities. All right. Now, I have the pleasure of passing it over to our speakers. We have, we'll go ahead and start with Humboldt County Supervisor Natalie Arroyo.
Thank you. It's nice to see you all. Thanks for joining during the lunchtime. So I'm Natalie Arroyo. I serve the 4th District of Humboldt County. I serve a small, geographically small but population dense district right on Humboldt Bay. And I also represent the community where the Humboldt port project, the heavy lift marine terminal, is located, right on Humboldt Bay. So a project you've been hearing a lot about with Humboldt and port infrastructure is right in the heart of my district as well. Some other hats I wear. I am a Coast Guard officer in the Coast Guard Reserves. I want to be clear that I'm not speaking today in that position, but I serve at the Pacific Strike Team in Novato, and I do hazmat response and pollution response, and I've done that my whole Coast Guard career. I've done, specialized in pollution response for the past 14 years. So I've been deployed to oil spills, I've been deployed to hazmat incidents, and when I think about the conversion to renewables, that's certainly front of mind. I also am a lecturer at Cal Poly Humboldt, so I teach in the Environmental Science and Management Department. And one of the roles that I fill as a county supervisor is I'm appointed to the Redwood Coast Energy Authority Board of Directors. so our local community choice organization. So lots of ways that my work intersects with energy. I'm really passionate about energy, and certainly been engaged in a lot of conversations about community benefits and what Humboldt County's role is in the process of seeing offshore wind, come into our community, both the offshore component and how people engage with, those projects and the developers, and how people think about the port and the transmission pieces of the project. So happy to have this conversation today about that.
Great, and we're going to pass this to Katherine. You're doing intro, yeah.
Happy lunch, everyone. I'm Katherine Hoff. I'm a researcher at CLEE, which is the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment. We are an applied research and policy think tank housed at UC Berkeley, and we focus on equitable implementation of effective environmental and climate solutions.
Good afternoon. I'm Robert Vessely. I am a commissioner with the Port St. Louis Harbor District, and I am a retired civil engineer, which sometimes helps and sometimes doesn't.
Did you want to talk about your work a little bit?
Well, the Port St. Louis Harbor District is a special district in the county. We're independent of the county of San Luis Obispo, and we have a fairly large area and fairly large population, but the port itself is focused on commercial and recreational fishing and other recreational activities, and it has been that way for a long time. Although it's had a history with energy in the past, going all the way back to whaling. There was a whaling station at our port, and then oil was discovered nearby, and it was shipped out of our port during World War I and since then. And then Diablo Canyon Power Plant is just right over the hill from us. So there's a lot of energy activities in our area.
Thank you. Katherine, I think you wanted to level set a little bit on community benefits, that you've got elected officials here. What should elected officials know?
Thanks, Megan. So for those of you who haven't been exposed to community benefits tools, I'm just going to give a quick rundown now. These are the real experts on the stage, so I'll turn it over to them afterwards. But just to get us all on the same page about what we're talking about. So CLEE has been working on offshore wind since 2019, and increasingly recently we've been working on community benefits tools, both on offshore wind and across different energy infrastructure projects. So we think of community benefits in terms of both policy drivers and community benefits tools. These can include things like community benefits agreements, project labor agreements, which you've heard mentioned today on stage, host community agreements, community benefits funds, and community benefits ordinances. Of course, these are only a few of the many tools and mechanisms that are out there. I know Brian Sabina is here at the conference. If you want a detailed explanation of tax credits and how those can benefit communities, please go find him. He is a wealth of information. I wanted to focus on policy drivers first. So these can include both incentives and requirements. Incentives can include things like bidding credits, which we saw in the California offshore wind auction, right? So developers were given credit in the auction against the total price of their bid for either workforce and supply chain, domestic manufacturing plans, and or community benefits agreements. So they weren't required, but they were incentivized by BOEM, the federal agency in charge of the auction. And then we also have ordinances or legislation that can create incentives for community benefits. So we have things like California state law AB 205, which expedites permitting for certain developers on certain kinds of projects if they negotiate community benefits with the local host community. Turning to requirements, We have policies that require specific benefits on specific projects. For example, you have a new housing development going in, what percentage of that housing project should be affordable housing. City council might make a certain restriction or requirement about that. And then we have things like community benefits ordinances. Detroit is one example. So that was an ordinance that was passed in the city of Detroit for projects over $75 million that requires developers to negotiate and communicate about the project with a neighborhood advisory council. Moving over to community benefits tools and mechanisms, we have here 4 different examples. The first is project labor agreements. So these are collective bargaining agreements that determine the working conditions on a construction project. Next, we have host community agreements. These are usually between the developer and the local government entity and can include a variety of benefits, monetary and non-monetary, including things like local infrastructure improvements and environmental benefits. And next, we have community benefits funds, which have been used all over the world and on the East Coast as well. And I know some folks in California are already talking about and implementing these as well. So these are just funds that a developer would contribute to a neutral entity to be used for the community and given out to community projects or groups, either as a one-time arrangement or over the course of the project. And then lastly, we have private CBAs, which many of you may already know about. These are private contracts, legally enforceable agreements between developers and a community group or a coalition of community groups. And when I say community, I mean tribal, labor, advocates, environmental groups, housing, et cetera. So this gives you an idea of the parties involved in each one. So PLAs are usually between unions and contractors, although there are public PLAs as well, which are between a government entity and a developer or contractor. Host community agreements are between the local government and the developer, although sometimes community can be involved. Community benefits funds, usually negotiated by either a local government entity or community groups, and then implemented by a neutral fiscal entity. And then finally, private CBAs, we've just talked about. Those are coalitions of community groups and the developer. Sometimes you can also have public CBAs, so that's a public entity negotiating with a developer for community benefits. So here's a little bit more about private CBAs. Again, these are legally binding, enforceable private contracts. Historically, they were tied to the delivery of particular permits. So a developer seeking permits in front of city council would go to a community and ask what benefits they needed, thereby making the path through public approval of those permits a bit easier because the developer would have public support. The caveat here is that the community groups or coalition would have to support or at least not oppose the development project. And then lastly, private CBAs can offer the opportunity for concrete benefits. So some of the things we've mentioned, like affordable housing or air quality monitoring or specific things that the community wants and needs. Public CBAs, as we said, are negotiated between project developers and municipality or other government entity. They often, although not always, result from community advocacy, and sometimes it's possible to arrange kind of a hybrid agreement, as in the Oakland Army CBA, where community groups can have some role in monitoring over the life of the project, or sign an agreement with a local government, ensuring that the local government will enforce the CBA. So that's just a snapshot to get us started, and looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, to just kind of get an idea of like what tools are at our disposal, and just really appreciate the partnership of academia to inform good policy, because we all need to be doing this as a collective effort to get it right for our communities. For Natalie and Bob, you know, we're the big elephant in the room, right? We know like federal is been a big kind of topic or non-topic that we're trying to avoid at this summit. We talk a lot about state leadership and how California is moving forward on a state legislative level, but local governments have power too. And so I want to ask you, what's your power? What's on your docket? You know, how are you dealing with offshore wind on a local level? And Natalie, I'll pass it to you.
Sure. Well, the County of Humboldt is not the developer of the port facility that's going to support this industry and other prospective industries, maritime uses, but it does lie within the unincorporated part of the county. So when it comes to the port facility in particular, we certainly have some land use control to a degree, and we will need to be making some updates around zoning and working with the Harbor District, so a partner public agency on that. We'll certainly have some jurisdiction over things like lighting and noise, and then when it comes to community engagement, I think many people are not familiar with the Harbor District as a special district. They see something in the unincorporated part of the county and they think, go to your county supervisor, go to your county rep. And a lot of times it's sort of scattershot when people try to reach out to government. It's like they try somebody. A lot of times that's me. So I find myself answering a lot of questions for folks about the kind of status of the projects, what I've heard from the developers, what I've heard from the Harbor District. And there's not always a lot of clarity about jurisdictional lines. So I think just helping people to get the information they want is a big part of my role. I'm certainly engaged in a lot of community outreach meetings, and Humboldt has, in our broader community, including tribal nations, have been really engaged for several years now on this process. So I think there's been a lot of conversation about what this community benefit structure should look like and who should be involved, and the county is poised to assist with that to the extent we can. And find a good mechanism, especially for doling out funding, but also for making clear to all the players what our community's concerns are. So when I hear concerns from the commercial fishing or aquaculture sector, I'm able to lift those up. And I don't want to make it sound like people are not already listening to them, because the Harbor District's doing a pretty great job of listening to everyone, as are the developers. Like I think there's been sincere outreach that's been happening and will continue to happen. But I also feel like it's my responsibility to continue to, voice the concerns that I'm hearing from community members, which are probably the same as they are everywhere. Like, what are the environmental impacts going to be? What are the housing impacts going to be of major infrastructure projects, particularly for a rural area? Transportation impacts. What might this mean for noise and lighting in the communities where, there's going to be new transmission projects or new port projects? All of those pieces are concerns in the community that come up, and we can talk about, more about that community outreach piece, but I see those as, a lot of my roles in the process, and to stay informed. I've also really wanted to use my voice to advocate for there being enough financial support for this industry. So talking to, state leaders and federal leaders who serve my community to amplify those needs as well. So that, my colleague on the Board of Supervisors likes to say, when the military does a big project, entire towns are built around that. The resourcing is pretty heavy. And so, we should see these energy projects as, national security and as, long-term, benefits for not only climate, but the energy security of our nation. And so there's also that element of, we need to resource it adequately. And I make sure to say that any chance I get.
I appreciate that. Yeah, what about you, Bob?
Port San Luis is if not unique, it's kind of unusual along the coast of California in the sense that it is a relatively sheltered harbor that, and the district was set up similar to Humboldt. The district is independent of the county. The county still has jurisdiction over things like land use planning and zoning, those sorts of things, but we are independent. And there are very few other harbors like ours up and down the coast. They get bigger real quickly. I think Crescent City might be the only one that has any relationship to us in terms of size. It was set up in the 1950s as a special district to support commercial fishing and recreational activities. And Port has 3 piers, one of which actually belongs to Cal Poly SLO. And one of them is quite an old pier. Actually, the first part of the pier was constructed just after the Civil War. It's a wooden pier. It's been through a lot of repairs, but and then another one is also belongs to us, and it's basically in the middle of the town of Avila. Some of you probably know the town of Avila, which is at the eastern end of the harbor, and it's somewhat discrete, somewhat different from the rest of the port. The rest of the port is commercial fishing and recreational activities, that sort of thing. And I first got started to be interested in this subject as far back as about 2010. And it was because there were discussions going on with the Navy about what areas off the coast could be designated as wind areas. And our county was involved in those discussions, and I was friends with one of the members of the Board of Supervisors, and he invited me to several meetings with the Navy, which diplomatically I could say were not very productive. But they finally got all that worked out. And but it convinced me that I needed to research this subject and find out what is all this about offshore wind. And learned a lot about Humboldt. But eventually I came back to our board and brought the subject up. And there were a lot of blank faces. There's only 5 members on our board, and 3 of them are either current or retired fishermen. So you can imagine they have a view about anything offshore. I mean, San Luis County was just going through the process of developing a marine sanctuary. Actually, we didn't develop it, the feds developed it. And our board was not crazy about the idea. I tried to convince them that when those kinds of things come along, don't take a strong position, but make sure you have a seat at the table. You know, get involved in the discussion and you might have some influence on it. But anyway, I learned a lot about offshore wind and and what it meant, and the time that first time I took it to the rest of my board to talk about it, like I said, there were all these blank faces. And I told them that this was a juggernaut that's coming towards us. And we need to participate. We need to be involved in this. It can have substantial effect on Port San Luis, the coast of California. We have a couple of serious advantages for offshore wind. There are 2 ports in our county. One is Port San Luis, and the other is Morro Bay. And both of those ports have nearby a connection to the grid. So they're great places to bring that big extension cord onto land and plug into the state grid. It's not that easy. And also, we're quite close to the Morro Bay wind areas. I think maybe Brian mentioned earlier that, you know, it's only, I forget what he said, 40 miles from our port out to the wind area, as opposed to any of the other ports that have been talking about O&M facilities, San Francisco, Port Hueneme, Ventura, and they are 3 times, 4 times the distance away. So just in terms of accessibility. So we did kind of have a little headwind initially on, because there was a study prepared and an article was placed in our local newspaper. On the front page, there was a photo of a drawing that had been prepared showing staging an immigration port in our harbor. And we all have an idea what a S&I facility looks like. It's acres and acres and acres of concrete and cranes and sinking areas and et cetera, et cetera. We have been fighting that image ever since. People still wave it at us. You can't do this, you know. So, but in that process, we dealt with clean energy terminals quite a bit and developed an agreement with them to look at the prospects of a operations and maintenance facility in our harbor. The county is involved in the sense that the county got some money from the state, which was quite appealing, and they commissioned a report, which is now underway. The staff is here that worked on that. They commissioned a report with Mott McDonald to look at the feasibility of O&M facilities either in our harbor or Morro Bay or some hybrid of those two things. So they're still working on that, and that's we're hopeful that that's going to provide us more information. But we have not really started with community outreach, and I think we are suffering from that. We'll talk about NIMBYism after a while.
Yeah, the first impressions, right, with that image. Yeah, I've heard about that. Katherine, I wanted to turn this over to you. EOPA did a roundtable last year, and we were really focusing in with communities that were on the front lines of fossil fuel infrastructure and what it meant to be in a community where the energy that was, keeping the lights on was also making people sick. And so I think, elected leaders who are on, local leaders are on the front lines of government, right? The person you see at the grocery store or when you're dropping off your kids, you're the one that people talk to because you're the most accessible branch of government. And you're also the most responsible because you live in that community, right? So Katherine, how do we recreate this energy paradigm, right? And design energy infrastructure that supports communities and doesn't end up harming them?
Well, great question. I will, up front just say there's no perfect solution, there are no perfect tools, there's no perfect CBA. And I'm sure a lot of folks on the stage and in the room have opinions as well. So hope to hear from you in the Q&A. One perspective might be that in order to build equitable infrastructure projects, it's important to have community benefits and it's important to have good process. So community benefits are meaningful, long-term, substantive benefits that the community actually wants and needs. And that can look like public health measures, maybe extra air quality monitoring or electrification of equipment, or it can be things like child care centers, or it can be things like workforce training and access to really good careers in the trades or in construction. So lots of different options there, and usually it should be determined by the host community and impacted communities and traditionally excluded communities. And then in terms of process, I think, again, it's important to make sure that traditionally excluded and impacted communities are at the table and that they also have the resources to participate in the conversation. We talked earlier today about how the CEC is including some community capacity building money into their grants to the ports. And there's also a bill at the legislature right now to try and do a similar thing for offshore wind in general. So that's important. And then I think the last piece is, if it's at all possible, having community give input and really listening to what they're saying and incorporating their feedback before the project design is finalized. So that makes community feel like they're being listened to, and creates trust and a good partnership between the parties in charge of the project and the community folks who are impacted.
I have something to add about that. I just thinking about this paradigm shift and how we're responsible for leading in that space. Both from the education and technical perspective, and providing that analysis, and in leading and being elected to lead. In a community where there are often difficult trade-offs, right, with things like this. But I moved to Humboldt County, California, from Louisiana after Hurricane Katrina. When I lived in Louisiana, though, I worked for this organization for a short period of time called the Louisiana Bucket Brigade, one of many organizations that would distribute air quality testing kits to impacted communities, and particularly really impoverished, primarily Black communities that were really close to factories. Last time I was in Louisiana, very recently, it was like, flying in, looking from the air, I remember like being a little kid and driving through Louisiana and being like, oh, it's like Christmas. There's so many lights, and the factories, and not to say like there are some also, that's an important source of jobs, and they make products and energy that people need, and so it's not, I don't mean to demonize those industries entirely, but the air quality impacts are severe, and the lack of regulation is significant. So sometimes I hear the, sort of permitting conversation and the regulation conversations. Everyone's like, oh, boo, permitting. And, it's like, also, I am grateful to live in a community where people care about that, where we have voters that care about it, and where we're committed to doing things right. And we have historically done things wrong. I'm also a governor's appointee to the board of the Klamath River Renewal Corporation, which took out the 4 dams on the Klamath in the last little while. Huge accomplishment. I got to do the very boring but important stuff, like the liability paperwork and stuff like that, but somebody has to. And, and I got to be part of this at the very tail end of this incredible project that, I also like give credit where credit is due to the tribes that were engaged in decades of advocacy, and people were laughing in their faces over the idea that these dams could ever come out, and they were hydroelectric infrastructure. So when we look at the history of energy production where I live, and in the part of the world where we're all talking about, there is a long, rough history of exploitation and of harm done to Native people and of harm done to poor people. So I take that really seriously when we come to this conversation. And I don't always know what the technical right answers are when it comes to like which mooring infrastructure is going to be least impactful. Like that's not me. That's not my area of expertise. Thankfully, there are people in this room who it is, but my job is to ensure that we're not failing to ask those questions about how to do this as best as we possibly can. There are always going to be trade-offs, and to also center that conversation about let's get real. Like this is one of the more renewable and least impactful ways to generate energy, and we need energy in the world that we live in. And we also have to like really look at the big picture and remind people that getting hyper-fixated on certain impacts also like might stymie progress in a way that that we don't want to do. So there's all of those. You have to be a container for all of those things in being a good community leader. And I know we've all probably struggled with that in our own ways.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
If I might, the role that local leaders play in these sorts of things is not written in any textbook or pamphlet that you could read, but it has occurred to me, in addition to my role as harbor commissioner, just give myself a raise. It's a situation where you can make of the job what you want. You can read the staff report on the morning of the meeting and attend the meeting and that's it. Or you can really be involved, and I chose the latter. Everyone has, I think, their own reasons for supporting or not supporting offshore wind. we're all aware of the climate change issues, but then community benefits comes up a lot. And in researching what has happened other places, the kinds of benefits that have developed, and I was mentored by some of the local labor people, and they talk about training programs as part of a community benefit. And it occurred to me that those are really amazing because they are training people who will carry on good jobs, good careers for the rest of their lives. So that investment pays out over a very long period of time. After I finished my education, I taught a little bit at Cal Poly, SLO. And I remember one of the things that I would tell each class was, if what you're looking for is a job, you're in the wrong place. What you're being trained for here is a career, and it's a lifelong thing. Just, take that in hand, that you're going to be a lifelong thing. So those kinds of training opportunities are lifelong, members of society that will benefit themselves and society. We're still talking about all the other kinds of community benefits that may come about as a result of this kind of a project. But San Luis County is not new to large developments like this. We have what used to be and may still be the largest solar plant in the country. And it's in a pocket of our our county that's has wonderful sunshine, and so they've put a plant out there. But as you can imagine, there was controversy. People didn't like the idea of an industrial scale plant, and they thought, well, you've heard all the arguments. And then the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant is in our county. As I mentioned, it's just over the hill from us. And I was living there when that plant was built. You can imagine also there was a lot of controversy about that. But projects get through that, they get built, and the benefits accrue.
Yeah, appreciate that. We're going to ask the audience if you all have questions. I know I have a lot more questions, but we promised we wanted to make this a little more interactive. So please don't be shy. Raise your hand or just shout out your question.
There's people in the audience with microphones, I think. I see at least one over there.
There's a mic, a roving mic. Come on. No? No takers? I don't see any. Oh, there we go. I see one. Gentleman over here. There we go. Thank you.
Hi, can folks hear me? Okay. I'm wondering if you could talk more about sort of local land use authority and ordinances and other sort of things that local governments can do to regulate projects like these. Thank you.
Sure. Well, I'll speak to my thoughts about some of the projects in Humboldt County, and of course, well, not of course, everybody may not know this, but transmission, the transmission award was just made for the north coast portion of the through the California Independent System Operator. So we have transmission projects coming our way, very recently awarded, still looking at what that will look like on the ground. I mean, the routing is fairly clear, but anyway, a lot to unpack there still from a local government perspective. So, we will have the ability to determine what forms of mitigation need to take place for projects, and to regulate things like noise and lighting, as well as zoning. There's an opportunity now with the harbor infrastructure to do some zoning updates. So that could also require mitigation for portions of the changes to the use there. So those are tools that we have at a local government level. Harbor districts have different tools and are thinking about a different set of constituents in a way. So I certainly want to hear Bob's thoughts on this, but those are some of the things that come to mind. And then, beyond that, we haven't really explored too deeply, but we could explore what, local hiring provisions might look like, what ordinances would look like that require community benefits for agreements to be in place for a certain scale of projects, either financial or geographic scale. So if it's over, X amount of land or X amount of money, we could implement, something that requires community benefits for all projects in the future that meet certain criteria. That's something that I think a lot of local governments are starting to explore more and more. And Humboldt County has a particular wrinkle in our story in that we don't have development impact fees set up. It sounds like we're the only county in California that doesn't have that structure quite in place. So we have to navigate this for each individual project, which is both a blessing and a curse. And developers, I think I've heard some concern from developers that they don't like it because there's not always that upfront clarity. So we have a particular wrinkle there to navigate around how we work with developers for any type of project that's in the unincorporated part of the county. But those are some things I'm, thinking through and working on right now, and that we're working with the developers of the transmission and port facilities on. Anything that's going to go, in the unincorporated part of the county falls to us to kind of figure out. There's also the need to site a large substation, electrical substation somewhere in the greater Humboldt Bay area. So looking forward to that conversation too. So lots of opportunities to, kind of get all the different agencies and partners together and try to navigate it. And each individual situation is unique. So unfortunately, we can use like toolkits to think about broader, broader approaches, and we do have to kind of tailor it to our community.
Local land use regulations, I think, are kind of the tip of the iceberg. I think, as is typical throughout the state, there are various levels. The county, as we said, the county has jurisdiction over land use, so things that would happen at Port San Luis on land, they get involved in. Our master plan at the port is ancient, needs to be updated. So in order to go through that process, then there's the local coastal plan has to be updated, and that's in conjunction with the county, and then that has to be approved by the Coastal Commission. So that's, there are various steps just to get to the point where something might be permittable in our harbor. It's like I said, it's the tip of the iceberg. Developers, I think, have much more of a heavy load to carry than we do.
Yeah, and I think the idea is to not be the barrier, but to be the catalyst for things to be done, lift all boats, as it were. Yeah, did I see Adam with a question? Can we run a mic over to that corner? Yeah.
I'm not allowed to ask questions.
Thank you.
Thanks for a great panel. Adam Stern with Offshore Wind California. I want to ask something I asked on the panel yesterday about public attitudes towards offshore wind, and I'm interested to hear from each of you, if that's possible. What do you think are the arguments when you talk to fellow residents in your community that actually help promote the idea that offshore wind is a good idea, and perhaps even talk about some of the stumbling blocks to getting people to yes? And I'm thinking about this in the context of there are going to be many years of conversations, but you're at the front line, so.
Yeah, and I think the distinction between the Central Coast and the Northern Coast is there's definitely organized opposition in the Central Coast, and so those conversations are hot and hard. So maybe Bob, we'll start with you.
They're difficult. And I think that we have been successful to a small degree in getting accurate information out. And those people who come to us who are skeptical begin to think about sea level rise, climate change, fossil fuels, those sorts of things. And then they think maybe there's something to discuss here at least. Some people, you'll never change their mind. But we've had kind of a balance at the last few meetings of people in support and those opposed, which has been refreshing.
I will say in Humboldt, I almost don't want to say this out loud, but don't think there's a fossil fuel sponsored organized opposition yet. If there is, I haven't heard about it, and it's very insidious. But I don't think that has taken hold. And in part, I have to give a lot of credit to community groups who've gotten involved in this conversation early. And laid the groundwork for environmental organizations and local small business organizations and tribes and commercial fishermen and aquaculture folks to come together and have these conversations. Now, not everyone is universally supportive, and folks have different ideas about what success would look like. But the doing that work on the front end has helped to not have fertile ground for misinformation to be sown as readily. So, and I frequently am in spaces where people raise like topics about that are debunked or just sort of misinformed that they've read on the internet. Like, I don't think it's an organized opposition again, but that people are like, what about this thing that I read? And where there are community members who are trusted to like respond, not always me, and sometimes it's just this sort of organic thing that I witness happening, and I'm thrilled to see it. I think I live in a very unique community where, similar to Bob, there's a strong culture of learning. We do have multiple higher education institutions who are also engaged in this, and I think some of the things I hear from constituents is that they're cautiously optimistic. They think there's opportunity for innovation and training and really specialized job opportunities, which is really cool for people that are that are unique to this sector. And that idea of being, at the tip of the spear in scientific innovation really carries a lot of weight in our community. I also, know that people care deeply about the perspective of tribes, and there have been varied perspectives from tribes. There are 9 federally recognized tribes in Humboldt County alone, and other not yet federally recognized tribes. So I think when folks are in different parts of the country or the state, perhaps they're not used to that diversity of tribal perspective and history. And so, there's also a clear message that I think I've heard at this conference, and certainly heard lately from tribal nations, that they want to be dealt in. A friend of mine that I was talking to earlier said, not just a seat at the table, but dealt in. So a player in the finances of the thing. And so that remains to be seen what that'll look like. But I think it's worth noting that that's a desire, and that is, perhaps that is what true justice would look like, is having a financial stake and a role in making decisions, and not just a seat at the table. So I'll leave that there for now, but those are some of my thoughts about it.
I'm afraid we're at time, and but I want to really appreciate the questions. I want to appreciate your participation, the panelists. I think with that last piece too, bringing in academia, the academic partners as those trusted partners, that's a really key ingredient to these conversations that we're having throughout the state. And I think this, this summit and a lot of the organizing that work that's going on throughout the state for us to stay in contact, stay at the table, not on the menu collectively, is going to really spell out our success to see clean, renewable, reliable, domestic energy that we help build together. So I want to really thank all of you for being here, and particularly our panelists for sharing their insights.